Hello, I'm Jane Hepburn. I'm on staff in the counseling program at Laidlaw College. And with me today is Reuben Munn, who is a senior pastor at Shore Community Church. He also does some teaching here at Laidlaw College. I'd like to thank you, Reuben, for being here today and having a chat with me.
It's a pleasure. Good to talk to you.
The counseling program has noticed things happening within the community, and it has to do with not just the global pandemic that we're still experiencing today, but people coming out of lockdown and back into normal, whatever normal is. And a lot of people aren't coping so well. So with regards to the pandemic, and it's all around the world, the fact there aren't many countries that aren't impacted by COVID-19. Just curious to hear your views and to hear what you might have to say about the church and the church's response to this.
Well, I guess maybe the first thing to say is I don't think in this situation there's any experts. I'm always cynical. I think at the moment when you hear someone claiming to be an expert about handling this situation or an expert about being in the midst of this crisis, because I think, well, none of us have been here before.
No.
None of us have been through anything like this. So there are no experts. We're all just trying to figure it out.
We're all learning.
We're all, in a sense, making it up as we go along. But I think that one thing I would say is I think within the Christian tradition, we don't want to overlook the fact that we have tremendous resources within our faith tradition that I think do help us to be able to speak into this and act into this.
Yeah.
We've got an incredible history, over the history of the church with plenty of examples, including examples early in the church of Christians responding to plague and responding to pandemic, and historical examples there of Christians that move towards those in need and serve the vulnerable and the disadvantaged and would move with love towards others when a lot of other people, I think, were moving away and would be fleeing places where this sort of thing was happening. Christians would act in love, seeking to follow in the way of Jesus. And in fact, one historian would point to things like that as one of the reasons for the growth of the church, that others were so impressed by this and the sacrificial love that Christians were showing. Right. It was one of the reasons that people were drawn to the Christian faith. So that sits in our own story. And then, of course, we have a Bible that is also full of the revelation of this God who moves towards the needy and the lost and the lonely, the disadvantaged in so many ways. I mean, you just think about the parable Jesus told of the sheep and the goats in Matthew, and he says, "You visit the sick. You've visited me. Whatever you've done, you've visited the prisoner, you've clothed the naked, you've fed the hungry. Whatever you've done for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you've done for me." And that's a good reminder to me that when we as individuals or as churches seek to take any steps towards serving and loving others in Jesus' name, that it's not so much, I think, about trying to be Jesus to people. I think it's largely about seeing Jesus in people. I mean, that's what Jesus said. If whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Yeah. So as we serve one another, as we try to embody the love of Christ however we can in the world and all the craziness that's going on, we should expect that we're actually seeing Christ. I think we're seeing him exactly where he said he'd be, in the faces of the broken and the hurting and the lost. And I think that, for me, helps keep us in a posture of humility. Right. This is not about coming from any position of superiority and looking down on others and serving others in some condescending way, but actually being willing to see Jesus and receive Christ from others who I might be seeking to love in some way. So those are a few, I guess, biblical, historical reflections that I think can guide us. Yeah.
I'm also aware that we're not alone in this, that God is with us. He is present with us, and we've had this time of chaos. It's been quite chaotic, working from home, trying to, those people who are parents and trying to teach children, taking the place of the school teacher at home, finding new ways of going to the grocery store. Do I have enough toilet paper? Some people have lost their jobs. It's been quite a chaotic time. And I'm also aware that our God is a God that created out of chaos.
Yes, you and I have talked about this.
Yes,
that beautiful story in Genesis 1 of God creating out of chaos and the way the Spirit of God hovers over the waters, and there's that Hebrew phrase in there to describe the earth as formless and void, and that Hebrew phrase tohu wabohu.
Yeah.
And I've drawn on that many times in describing the way that life is full of chaos. It's full of chaos at the best of times, isn't it? But even more so in the past few months, just the amount of change. Just waves and waves of change and turmoil and upheaval across multiple spheres of life, I think, as well for people. That's the compounding thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that it's not just one thing. It's everything has changed. Family life changed for a time there.
Yeah.
Working life changed and is still changing for a lot of people. I think the workplace is certainly a place where there's still huge turbulence, turmoil going on, financial life, social life, church life. So there is that chaos. But yes, the beauty of the way that the Spirit hovers over that.
Yes.
And broods over that and brings life out of that. And I just love that picture of there is just inherently chaos and brokenness in the world. And yet we can have that confidence that even in the midst of that, the Spirit of God is hovering and is bringing somehow, maybe in ways we don't see, but somehow bringing life out of the tohu wabohu, out of the chaos of life. So I think that's something to hold on to, absolutely.
Yeah. How do you see faith, hope, and love in this time?
I guess I see them being worked out in very practical, everyday, earthy kind of ways. But I think those virtues, those values, are things that are so desperately needed, and maybe more so now than at other times. I mean, you just take one of them, just think about hope. And I would say that for so many people, that story of hope maybe that they've been clinging on to, and that general cultural story of hope that we have believed in Western culture for hundreds of years, that generally society is on this upward progression. I think there's just so much that is puncturing that story. And even in the 21st century, we've had 9/11, we've had the GFC, now we've got COVID, and you think that narrative of secular hope that our culture has lived by is pretty battered and bruised. And I think that's left a huge amount of people asking, well, where can I find real hope? Where can I find something that's more than just this kind of wishful thinking or kind of a utopian pipe dream, because that just doesn't seem to have materialised. And I think it's a moment for the church. It's a moment for Christians to have a sense of confidence about ourselves, about our gospel, to be able to step into that and speak a word of hope to others in an encouraging way, but lovingly and graciously, to point people towards the source of true hope that ultimately transcends our circumstances and our situations. But to do that in love, I think, is the key. That it's not just something I'm saying, this is something we are hopefully seeking to embody through just humble love and kindness, looking out for one another, just those everyday practices of just loving each other. But with an awareness, I think, that there is a message of hope to speak into that, when we have the opportunity.
We have been in a time of disconnection while we were in lockdown. So we were disconnected from our families, from our friends. We were disconnected from our churches, our schools, disconnected from our work or our normal work practices. We were disconnected from if someone had a family member or a friend died, we were disconnected from our normal ways of practicing coming together. It just wasn't available for us. So curious about how we as a church can be agents of hope and agents of love, agents of faith as we reconnect with our community.
Yes. Yeah, and one of the things that I've realised, I think, through this is that we've had a lot of pastoral care going on within the church and to some extent in the local community, but a lot of it has not been directly related to COVID. And this is the interesting thing. There's a degree of, there's the ones that have lost jobs, and there's ones that have taken hits with salary and so on, and there's direct COVID-related issues there. But what we've found as well is somehow, I think, particularly in the lockdown time, it created a set of conditions that surfaced a whole lot of other issues that now need to be dealt with in some sort of way. And so in some instances, that was quite positive. For example, there was a woman in our church who had had a really difficult employment issue and had just gone through an awful time in her workplace pre-COVID. But just having that month to think about things and some good time for reflection, she came through that and realised there was a lot of emotional stuff that she hadn't dealt with and had not processed out of that situation. And so she wanted to then go and seek some counselling, which was great. So that wasn't directly related to COVID, but it just gave her the time to have a think. There was another married couple in our church who, through just the sheer time that they were then forced to be together during lockdown, realised some things about their marriage that needed to be worked on. And they weren't in dire straits, but they realised we can actually really grow in our relationship. There's some things here that we're seeing now that we weren't seeing before. And so they've taken some steps to get counselling. And then, of course, for others, it was much more of a struggle. I mean, there's examples of couples, marriages that really did struggle during that time. And I think for some people, COVID amplified what was already there. Maybe in some ways it's a bit like the physical virus itself, that if there were underlying issues already, those were the ones I think that were most vulnerable. And so I guess that's just helped me from a pastoral care perspective to have a slightly broader view of the types of issues that we're dealing with here. It's not just purely things that have a direct relationship to COVID. It's a whole range of issues that have just been brought to the surface by COVID. And so, you know, it's really case by case, I guess, in terms of how we respond to those. It's a lot of journeying with people. It's a lot of referral and being a signpost, you know, particularly for me as a pastor. I'm the first to recognise I'm not a counsellor, but I need good counsellors around me that I can point people towards. It's a lot of listening to people, I think, just validating their story and their experiences and what they're feeling. I think it's a lot of encouraging too, to be honest. It's just the simple practice of encouragement. People are so starved of it. It's amazing just how rare it is, but just being able to speak words of hope, speak life-giving words is incredibly powerful. So it's just some of those simple practices, I guess, that we're trying to put into practice, but across a huge range of situations, It
occurs to me that the church here in New Zealand has a great opportunity to show itself more, or perhaps become more visible in New Zealand without saying, you know, come for the Alpha course or come do this program, that we can actually go out and be Jesus, to show examples of how Jesus responded in community.
I think so, And so often that follows relational pathways, I would say. And that's what we've found. I mean, we did sort of put a general appeal out through some community networks, and we have a relief fund that was available. But we found that where we had opportunity to serve people was generally where there was some established connection or relationship with that person. So our community pastor has got a connection with various community leaders or community board people. And through one of those connections, someone let him know about a family that had just moved into emergency housing in Albany. And I think they had 6 kids or something, and really struggling through the lockdown time, didn't have a lot of money. So he was able, just through that connection, to go and get some grocery vouchers, drop them off, and had a conversation with them and just journeyed with them and just listened and just tried to be a supportive presence. But it came through connection and it came through relationship, and I think that's just so often how it happens. So I totally agree. It is the church, and it is a moment, I think, for the church to, I guess, show the world what the way of Jesus looks like through faith, hope and love. But when you bring that right down to a ground level, it's individuals and families within the church who follow Christ, just seeking to look around them and ask, well, who do I know? Who's in my world? Whether it's on my street or at my kid's school or at the gym or whatever. And how can I just take an interest, maybe ask some good questions, and just show unconditional love and see what happens and see where that goes, and be willing to be available, to be supportive, to be a little bit inconvenienced, I think, for people sometimes, to allow myself to be a little bit interrupted by other people depending on what the needs are. But I think to tap into our own relational networks and pathways is generally the way to go.
Do you have any last words of advice, I suppose, as your experience pastoring a church? Any last words of wisdom, or if you could reach out and talk to the churches here in New Zealand, what might be helpful for them?
I think to recognise that we've been through an incredibly intense time, But this is still going to be a very long journey. And I think a lot of the repercussions of what people have gone through, whether it's directly COVID related or whether it's unrelated issues, I think are going to be things that people are working with and working through for a long, long time. So I wouldn't want us to see this as, hey, how did we do over the last 2 months? Let's evaluate ourselves, or just focus on acute issues. I think that there are long journeys. There's still a lot of uncertainty. I think the horizon that any of us can even see now in terms of our lives, our country, is very short. We just don't know. You know, it's hard to see much beyond a couple of months now. We're not used to living like that.
Yeah.
So I think we have a short time frame that we can see, but a long journey ahead of us. So I think it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think to have that long-term view of things, a long-term view of journeying with people over time, but that also it does come down to very simple and everyday practices of incarnating the love of Christ and just being faithful to those who are in front of us, who God brings along our path, and just seeking to show kindness and love, and ultimately pointing them towards the source of hope as we have the opportunity.
Thanks. Well, that's all we have time for at the moment. I want to thank you, Reuben, for joining me today and
Pleasure.
having this quick chat.
Thank you.
Thank
Good to
you.
be here.